Well, it's so good to be with you. We've got two presentations coming up, this one and the following one. They are centered around Daniel 8, but I have backed out to address two really important things for you. And that is the essence of time in Daniel 8 and 9, which we'll be talking about here over the next few presentations. That's really important. But this presentation today is of great importance. The most popular view on Daniel 8 is the view of a 2nd century interpretation pointing towards Antiochus Epiphanes. And today we're going to address the challenges that are presented in that interpretation and show you that there's something far more significant going on than a 2nd century fulfillment. And I'm just hoping that will work for you. And I want to just pause right now and thank Sherry again for the beautiful, beautiful picture that she has brought to us today. And I hope you enjoy the peacocks, the white and the blue one. Maybe I've shown this to you before, but it's still one of my favorites, so thank you, Sherry. It's like when we were at Maryhill Museum and these peacocks were walking around on the grounds. They would stop and pose for Sherry. So obviously they like having their picture taken. So thank you, Sherry, so much for that. So I hope you're ready. Let's jump into this presentation. We are in the book of Daniel. Daniel's name means God is my judge. And so if you don't believe in a judgment, then the book of Daniel could be problematic for you. But at the same time, God is my judge for Daniel is the best news in the whole world. And it was his name from childhood up into adulthood. So I'm hoping as we journey with Daniel, we will learn the lessons that he has saved for us from the time he wrote this book up to the present. Okay, so part 5, here we go. There are a group of scholars that have suggested that in chapter 8 of Daniel, that verses 13 through 14, 16, when you see the numbers 26a, that means the first portion or first half of the verse, and 27b, these particular group of historical critical scholars claim that they're not genuine parts of the vision. Now, I'm not sure if they were there with Daniel, but I kind of doubt that is the case. But in order to throw them out, they have some real problems because they have deleted them to make their interpretation say what they wanted to say. Now, they're historical critical scholars that started back in the 18th century and are still present today. And how do I know that? Because the view of Daniel 8, not talking about the little horn power and its connection to Rome, is the most popular version of the interpretation. But what I'm trying to tell you is in order to make that interpretation work, they've had to delete 3 full verses and 2 half verses of chapter 8. I want you to think about that. If you just go deleting verses, couldn't you make any chapter of the Bible pretty much say what you think it should say? And if you have to do those kinds of calisthenics of interpretation to make it say what you want, then there's some significant problems. So let me begin with Daniel 8, verse 8. It says, "Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds." So that sentence ends speaking now of the 4 winds. Notice verse 9. "Out of one of them," and this is where the sticking point begins, "out of one of them the 4 winds came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the north, or towards the beautiful land." So what I'm saying is I just made a major change in contemporary biblical interpretation of Daniel by simply saying that the horn came out of the 4 winds. Now, let me explain that to you before I move on to my next verse. The reason I tell you that is because the gender and the tenses of Daniel 8, verse 9 connect correctly with the 4 winds and not with the 4 horns. In order to make that horn coming up out of the 4 horns, listen carefully, you have to ignore the Hebrew language structure that is already in the text itself. Just completely ignore it, as if it doesn't exist. But if you're paying attention to the Hebrew language, then the only possible interpretation would be that one of them, the four winds, came forth a rather small horn that grew exceedingly great. It started out very insignificant. And just tuck that away. There's more we could do, but we're working on these short presentations, so I'm going to move right on. Hope that gives you a basis for what I'm about to say. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth and trampled them down. Now, that little horn starts small in the earthly realm, but it grows up and reaches up into the heavenly realm and causes the host and some of the stars, the host would be God's people, and the stars to fall to the earth and be trampled down. So there's a vertical aspect. It is a religious, political power that emerges in verse 10. It has strong religious implications. It even magnified itself to be equal with the prince of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and in the place of his sanctuary, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. So this little horn elevates itself to be equal with the heavenly prince, that would be Christ, and attempts to utterly bring Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary down to earth and pretend to be able to do the work of Christ on earth, to forgive sins and to restore and do the work of Jesus here. Now, we would call this blasphemy, because this little horn was not anointed or sacred. It was just simply a political power that emerged. A horn represents authority and power. In this case, political, coming off a beast. All right? So let's look at verse 12. And on account of of transgression, the host, that's God's people, will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. So it has a way of distorting truth. This little horn is going to attempt to recreate the heavenly sanctuary in heaven down on earth for its own purposes. That has strong religious political implications. So, next slide says the historical critical scholars interpreting Daniel reject verses in chapter 8, 13, 14, 16, 26a, and 27b, as I've already addressed, as being added by a later interpolation. Therefore, they ignore or do a workaround. However, in all of the manuscripts, old and recent, that you can find on the book of Daniel, those verses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, are in every single manuscript. Which means that if they're in every single manuscript, they cannot find one in which the verses are missing, where they have been added later. Now that is enough evidence right there to say you do not have permission to remove them. Their rejection of the above verses is their attempt to match their interpretation to be talking about Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century as a fulfillment of the little horn. Enough said. They don't stop there, however. They also say that chapters 1 through 6 are part of a different book of Daniel, like there's 2 books of Daniel, and are inconsistent with chapters 7 to 12. So then these particular group of historical critical scholars throw out the first half of the book and say, well, that's a different book. Why do they do that? By fragmenting the book, it supports their preferred view, referring to the events of Antiochus in the 2nd century. To do this, they have to ignore Hebrew linguistics, tenses, gender, by adding and deleting words of the verses and chapters of the book of Daniel. In other words, if you just take a surgeon's knife and cut it up and throw enough of it away, then they must have the right interpretation. And friends, what I'm trying to tell you is this is the most popular interpretation of Daniel 8 in religion today. That should cause you some concern. So verse 13 is a verse that's deleted. Let me read it to you. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking. Now notice Daniel is only hearing. This is auditory. How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? Verse 14 is another verse thrown out. And he said to them, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Now, the part of chapter 4, or verse 14 in chapter 8 they keep, they have actually changed it. Okay, I want you to notice this carefully. The text in the original Hebrew reads, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. That is a time prophecy. But here's what the scholars have done. They changed the language. They changed the words around in the sentence with no evidence to do that. And they say, it actually should be, say, evenings and mornings, talking about sacrifices. You see, to say morning and evening, they can then say each day is, like 2 days. So the 2,300 evening and mornings are only 1,150 days rather than 2,300. Now here's the problem with that. The language Daniel used is the exact language of Genesis on the creation day. It says it was evening and morning the first day. There was evening, morning the second day. It is the Hebrew idiom for simply stating that a day is an evening and a morning. Now, they flip it over and say, well, no, it's about sacrifices. It is not what God said to Daniel. It's a literal evening, morning equals a prophetic day. And Daniel chose those words with the greatest of care. They have no basis just to flip the words around and say, well, we think it's sacrifices, therefore the time prophecy really isn't 2,300, it's only 1,150. Can you understand when you distort the Word of God, then you lose the meaning of the prophecy? So 2,300 prophetic days to restore the sanctuary. Daniel is given a prophetic time in chapter 8 that has significant information about the coming Messiah. We'll see that in 8 and 9 as we pursue this. In verse 14 he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. To change the language is to ignore the importance of the words chosen by Daniel to convey what he had heard spoken in the vision. It is a rejection of Christ's ministry to us after his ascension. If you do away with those 2,300 days, you will have a prophecy that cannot accurately be pointed to as having been fulfilled. It will always be off in its accuracy. Verses 15 to 17. The scholars disregard verse 16, so I'm going to read 15, 16, and 17 as a whole verse. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the Ulai, and he called out and said to me, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to where I was standing, and when he had came, I was frightened and fell on my face, and he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now you notice they took out that portion about Gabriel saying, give this man understanding of the vision. To me that's just like shocking. Now while he was talking with me, this would be verse 18, I sank into a deep sleep with my face on the ground, to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand upright. And he said, behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur in the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So now we're going to look at the ram's identity. Here's the interpretation of verse 20. The ram which you saw with two horns represent the kings of Media and Persia. Going on to verse 21. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressions have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. He will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without and has been he will be broken without has been told is true. But behold the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. So I'm going to go back here and look at verses 26 and 27. Now on this slide, there's something I want you to pay attention to. The red part, okay, is the part that's been deleted by contemporary scholars. Okay. The blue part and the black part is what is retained in the verse. So on the top half of the screen, I have the whole verses, 26 and 27. On the bottom half, I will show you what they have decided they think it really says. So you can see what happens when they start surgically removing portions of the Scriptures. So here's what the Bible actually says in verse 26. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. Verse 27. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for many days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business. But I was astonished at the vision, and there was none to explain it. So this is what they claim now in their wisdom it actually says. Seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted for many days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business. So they take out the part about the evenings and mornings being true. What? Excuse me? They just delete it? And then they just say, and Daniel was really tired. They don't go on to say anything about Daniel's perplexity because he could not understand and have it explained, because when you get further into the story in chapter 9, the angel reappears to explain it. But if you take that out, then you can disconnect chapter 9 from chapter 8 and make it say whatever you want. It is unbelievable to me that someone called a Bible scholar would just go through and delete what they don't like, when they have no literary basis to do that. You see, interpreting the Bible by being faithful to the Word brings God into greater understanding. So if you're not faithful to the Word, then you will end up distorting the character of God. Interpreting the Bible based on your preconceived conclusion or presupposition creates a distorted truth, which then is not truth at all. So what I'm trying to say is that the most popular version of the book of Daniel in its interpretation by modern scholars actually doesn't have the truth that's contained in the book for us to hear and understand it. And I'm telling you this because I want you to pay attention that there's something important in the future days at the end of time that is relevant to you and me in the book of Daniel. And if the scholars have taken that out and distorted it so we can't understand it, then the message of God will not ring clear to us in a healthy and positive way. So I end up with one of Sherry's lovely pictures here of a starfish on the Northern California coast. There's just some spectacular pictures, but you know, that is just such a lovely, lovely creature. You don't often just get to see one up that close. So I want to thank Sherry for her work, and I want to thank you for taking a moment to listen. We're trying to make these short, succinct, but put as much information in as we can for you to challenge you to go back and read the book of Daniel, because something important is there, something important for you and for me, and we don't want to miss it. Thank you very much. Blessings. Take care now.